The origin story of the United States has always been somewhat controversial. Traditionally, history books have focused on the discovery and settlement of a new world by civilized European colonists. This approach oftentimes ignores, minimizes, or devalues the societies that existed prior to Christopher Columbus, their rich history, culture, and contributions. As we go through chapter 1, we'll be looking at a series of essential questions. The first, how did geographic and environmental factors shape the development of a diverse array of communities prior to European discovery? Indeed, native people in the New World were incredibly diverse. And while we can't take the time to study each of the groups, it is important to note that their diversity was largely a factor of geographic and environmental differences. In other words, the way that Native American societies adapted was based on the environment in which they existed. The history of the United States could extend back to the history of the Earth itself. As you've learned in previous social studies classes, at one point, our globe looked very different, with all continents being massed together on a supercontinent known as Pangaea. The breakup of Pangaea and the shifting of plates and natural geographic phenomenon shaping the continents into what they are today and could be said to have an impact on the people who ultimately would settle here. Eventually, in our class, we will be doing a geography overview where you'll be testing out on significant physical formations and the history of the United States could be said to be as old as the history of the globe itself. As you've learned in previous social studies classes, our Earth hasn't always looked the way it currently does. For example, at one point, all continents were massed together in a supercontinent known as Pangaea. Plate tectonic shifting and other geographic phenomenon have molded the way our landscape and our environments look today. And those changes have impacted and shaped the cultures that have been here in the past, are here in the present, and will be here in the future. While there are competing theories about how North and South America became inhabited, the most popular theory is that the ancestors of present-day Native American people migrated from Northeast Asia near Siberia roughly 35,000 years ago. Okay. This would have been at the end of the last ice age. Now, it's important to note that this period extended over 250 centuries or 25,000 years, while sea levels were low. These groups would have followed game out into an area stretched between Siberia and present-day Alaska, known as Beringia. The Bering Sea takes its name after this region. Over that 25,000 years, Native people migrated across this land bridge and into northern Canada. Now, this is a controversial theory. There is some evidence that suggests that people predated this particular time. One theory that has a little bit of evidential support includes a water route migration. There have been remains found in Chile that predate 33,000 BC. If that's the case, it's going to be very difficult to track other artifacts along the coast, as land erosion and water has done much to diminish the amount of archaeological evidence that can support that theory. The best evidence that North Asian people are ancestors to Native American people exists in dentistry. Similar dental features between Native Americans and Northeastern Asians suggests a common ancestor. Three of the most prominently known civilizations that existed in North and South America prior to Spanish discovery or in present-day Latin America. The Incans, the Mayans, and the Aztecs are all notable because of the size, the magnitude of their communities and their cultures. While today villages of 20,000 people would not be considered substantial, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which boasted more than 20,000 people at the time Cortez arrived, would have made it larger than both London and Paris. These civilizations had a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy, and they had sophisticated religious systems and were renowned artisans. The Spanish, however, focused on the parts of their culture that they did not understand. For example, the elements of human sacrifice and cannibalism in the religion of the Aztecs. This is an early Spanish map of the New World. You can see it reflects the biases and the assumptions of its day. The assumption that North America was much smaller and closer to Asia than it actually was. The assumption that the settlements in the New World by the Spanish were right and just and symbols of progress. The birth of New World civilization is largely the result of the agricultural developments of its people, especially corn growing became part of Native American civilizations in Mexico and South America and present-day Southwest United States. Irrigation systems and this staple crop could sustain large populations. The Aztecs, the Pueblos, all were part of what is now known as the corn culture. This is a statue of a corn goddess from the Moche culture of present-day Peru. It was made between 200 and 600 BCE and vividly illustrates the centrality of corn to native people 1,000 years before the rise of the great Incan and Aztec empires that Europeans later encountered. So, while oftentimes our assumption of native people in the New World was that they lived in small, scattered, impermanent settlements and followed nomadic lifestyles, there were regions of the New World, especially in the Southwest and present-day Mexico, that were able to establish permanent villages and develop sophisticated civilizations because of the value of corn. Agriculture allowed for native people to be more sedentary, to establish themselves in one place and to grow, not only in numbers, but in a way in which their culture and their technology and um, uh, their scope of influence in their regions also grew. For example, as corn culture spread to what is today presently Southwest United States, corn culture was adapted by the Pueblo, um, which are probably most famous for their buildings. It's an interesting story when you look at the exploration of Francisco Coronado and find that he was in search of these cities of gold, which were the mud adobes of the Pueblo. And when he got there, after coming up here through Kansas and Oklahoma, he was very disappointed to find these permanent mud huts, and the only gold that he could uncover was corn. Other areas were not exposed to corn culture, and their climates required a different mode of lifestyle. The Great Plains, the Lakota, and the Mandan were more nomadic, following their food source, the buffalo, uh, depending on the season. Uh, Western tribes of the Pacific tended to be more permanently settled along the coast because of aquaculture, depending on the ocean and fish for their sustenance. Corn eventually spread to the southeast portion of present day United States, where the Cherokee, Creek, and Chickasaw developed sophisticated agricultural societies, and along the Atlantic coast seaboard, um, where the Iroquois developed what's known as three sister farming. While all native societies could be considered developed, civilized, the development did reflect the environmental and geographic realities of their settlements. In most places where corn culture wasn't able to sustain large populations, social life was less elaborately developed. Most settlements were smaller and centered around family relationships. So a tribe was uh, largely a extended family. Nation states, for example, the Aztecs, which had very obvious borders and a realm of control, did not exist except for in Latin America. But there were city states, to say, or large cities that were able to sustain tens of thousands of people. For example, the mound builders of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. The Mississippi settlement of Cahokia is something we've talked about. Temperate climate and sophisticated agriculture were able to support large population centers. I'd mentioned three sister farming. This was what today we would call an agroscience renovation, in which several crops were worked together. Basically, corn or maize would be grown, and beneath the corn, beans and squash were planted. And as the corn grew, the stalk acted as a trellis for the beans and the squash to climb up, and waste from the village would be used as fertilizer. And these practices then provided an abundance of food so that it would result in a larger population. These practices were shared with early European settlers, like the Pilgrims. The Iroquois came to the rescue of the Pilgrims, as you know, with the first Thanksgiving, by showing them these modern agricultural techniques. But not just agriculture was important to these civilizations. They should also be recognized for their developed systems of government. The Iroquois Confederacy developed a large network of allied tribes that participate in a very democratic form of national government. Each tribe would send men to the Confederacy to address their mutual concerns, typically relating around military alliances, but also social networks. While men were largely the representatives to the Confederacy, their position was dependent upon the support from the women of their village. The Iroquois could be said to be a matriarchal society in which women had a lot of control over domestic affairs. In Iroquois society, when a man married, he moved away from his family and into the family dwelling of his wife. And so women always stayed with their village, which made the oldest woman of the village the most politically influential person. Add to that the Iroquois lived in what were called longhouses, and these longhouses were run by the oldest member of each family, oldest woman member of each family. The Eurocentric model of traditional American history overlooks a great many things. Most importantly, the civilizations that existed in the New World prior to Columbus's discovery, each rich with its own history and culture, shaped by the geography and the environment in which these societies developed. In fact, it ignores the fact that the Spaniards were not even the first Europeans to settle in the New World. As early as 1000 CE, Norse seafarers from Scandinavia were routinely landing in present-day Newfoundland, a place they called Vinland because it was a place where they could dry and cure their fish and cultivate grapes. When we think of the Age of Discovery, really what we're thinking about is the beginning of permanent settlement in North and South America, where ambitious Europeans came in an effort to try to get to Asia and establish new trade routes and access resources that would benefit their home countries.